The last talk is going to be regarding testicular cancer fundamentals, and this is, kind of my clinical and research passion. I feel like many times when it comes to testicular cancer, the thought is that we can do basically anything, and these men are curable. And as we've learned over the last 50, 70 years or so with platinum-based chemotherapy, that while we are curing these men, we're actually many times introducing them to long-term toxicities that they have to contend with for the rest of their lives. So let's talk a little bit about ways to kind of novel approaches to maybe make sure that we really optimize the care of these young men. So despite the fact that it's highly curable, it is responsible for the most life years lost for any non-pediatric cancers. It is the most common cancer in men between the ages of 18 and 45. A little bit more common than penile cancer, where there's about 2,000 cases a year. We see about 10,000 cases annually. And fortunately, the vast majority of these patients are going to be curable with some combination of chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation as well. It's really integral to the management of these patients that we minimize toxicity while maintaining their long-term excellent cancer controls. And a big part of that is actually to mitigate some of the delays in diagnosis that are seen. There's actually pretty good data that suggests that when you do things like exploratory surgery, instead of just doing a testicular exam, that patients can have delays in the type of treatments that they actually need and worse clinical outcomes. So starting with screening, the United States Preventive Services Task Force recommends against screening for testicular cancer. This is controversial, maybe not quite as controversial as PSA screening. And the idea would be that there could be a lot of unnecessary test anxiety from incidentally discovered scrotal findings like epididymal cysts and so forth. However, I think practically, if the patient does have risk factors, a personal or a family history of testicular cancer, a history of an undescended testicle, or concerns with fertility, it's easy enough to just run through how to do a self-exam. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. When you're intaking the patients, I think the critical bits of the history are: have you ever had a history of an undescended testicle or hernia repair as a kid? A family history of testicular cancer, a history of atrophic testicles, small shrunken testicles, any issues or problems with fertility, and then broader testicular and scrotal systemic manifestations, which I'll mention here in a moment. One of the questions I get quite frequently are regarding microlithiasis. So these are going to be incidentally discovered small calcifications within either one or both testicle. And generally, in the absence of these risk factors, which you can see here, having microlithiasis doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to develop a testis cancer or that you're at a higher risk of developing testis cancer. So that's something that I think we could be familiar and comfortable with as a urologist, because it can be a source of anxiety for patients as well as referring providers. Signs and symptoms. Testis cancer can really present in a variety of different ways. If the spread of testicular cancer is very reliable. It goes from the path of descent from the testicles, where they begin up at the level of the kidneys, to the scrotum. And sometimes we see abdominal pain, back pain, flank pain. And in a young man between 18 and 45 years old, if they've got this kind of significant pain, and certainly if they've got some imaging suggesting a retroperitoneal mass, it really behooves us to do a scrotal exam. Less common things: neck masses, gynecomastia, infertility can also occur in the context of testicular cancer. So when the patients come in, you of course want to do a comprehensive physical exam, including a scrotal exam. This is a resource from the Testis Cancer Awareness Foundation. A lot of really wonderful support groups that exist. You really want to check your tumor markers, AFP, LDH, and ACG, before performing your orchiectomy. And again, always want to do that scrotal exam. For a suspicious scrotal mass, so somebody's coming in to see you, of course you want to get an ultrasound and tumor markers. If you can get it covered by insurance, many times it's nice to get your staging imaging done prior to the orchiectomy. Sometimes we see these false positive enlarged masses or lymph nodes that can be misleading if it's done after surgery. I generally recommend getting a CT scan, chest, abdomen, pelvis. So if, say, down the way, something new develops, like a small pulmonary nodule, you have a baseline going into it. One of the things that I think we can really do a bit of a better job on is discussing whether or not patients are interested in testicular prosthesis. That's a common thing. There's a little bit of logistics. Many times you have to arrange that with a rep to bring that device in. So this is a simple thing that I think we can act upon as urologists. And then fertility concerns, certainly if they've got a contralateral atrophic testis or something along those lines, get in touch with your fertility team to offer sperm banking, cryopreservation, and things along those lines. Anytime I see a new patient, I always spend an extra minute just to let them know, listen, this is going to be kind of a dynamic process for you, but you're young, you've just gotten hit with a cancer diagnosis. Having some degree of anxiety and depression is normal, and try to get them in touch with our Cancer Center support services, because I think it's a lot for these young cancer survivors. If you get your markers in your ultrasound, your markers are negative, and the ultrasound doesn't quite look like a testis mass, and worthwhile reviewing with the radiologist. If the patient's reliable, per guidelines, it's totally reasonable to repeat the imaging in about 6 to 8 weeks. We don't want to do a lot of benign orchiectomies necessarily. You can discuss partial orchiectomy as well for these marker negative equivocal masses. Really need to have your expert GU pathologist on board. And these are going to be best suited for masses that are kind of in either pole of the testicle. A central mass is going to be a little bit more difficult. After orchiectomy, you really want to check those tumor markers and make sure that you follow them until they nadir out to a baseline. I think this is another real common area of mismanagement. I had a patient with a stage 1 yolk sac tumor. AFP was 5,000. And we watched it for 3 months. It normalized. He's been disease-free for 2 years out. And again, starting out with that high-quality contrasted CT scan, really no rhyme or reason to do a PET scan as the initial staging in either seminoma or non-seminoma. So just quickly running through some of the common clinical scenarios, stage 1 seminomas, outside of any type of really extenuating circumstances, surveillance is going to be the preferred option. Overall recurrence risk, 15% or so, and nearly 90% of those patients are going to be salvageable even if they were to recur. So take-home message for stage 1 seminoma is that surveillance is going to be a preferred option. Stage 2 seminoma, also highly curable. Historical options are local or regional radiotherapy or systemic good risk-directed chemotherapy, highly effective with relapse-free survival at about 95%. As I mentioned, we do know that chemotherapy, and certainly in that small sliver of patients that require radiation and chemotherapy, that their risks of bad things like heart disease and secondary malignancies is quite dramatic and quite high. This is a kind of landmark study from Scandinavia that really brought this to the forefront about 15 years ago. There's been some efforts to try to decrease some of the toxicities of chemotherapy and radiation. This is one particular study called the SEMS trial, surgery for early stage metastatic seminoma, small volume retroperitoneal disease. Suffice to say, in this study where they followed patients for about almost 3 years, 22% of the patients recurred. Of course, the other, conversely, about 80% were cancer-free, and all of them were alive. So there's a couple of new strategies that are entering the stage 2 seminoma space, and this is one to kind of keep your ear out for. Stage 1 non-seminoma, it's tough to really predict at an individual level who's going to relapse and who's likely to be cured by removal of the orchiectomy. Generally, I would say observation is still going to be the standard. One caveat, if they have any malignant transformation in the area of the testicle, that's one where they probably need to think about an upfront retroperitoneal lymph node dissection per the American Urology Association guidelines. Stage 1B, they should really have a balanced discussion of single cycle chemotherapy, RPL&D, or observation. We typically favor observation. Then in the non-seminoma land, again, kind of thinking about the long-term toxicities, where we're trying to mitigate those, taking a kind of deliberate approach, repeating imaging in 6 to 8 weeks to make sure patients don't develop metastases or that those lymph nodes don't involute. Newer data suggests that primary RPL&D can be curative in about 80% of patients, really regardless of the nodal burden. So these options should be discussed with a urologic oncologist, medical oncologist, and multidisciplinary teams. So in conclusion, this is a highly curable disease. There are long-term toxicities. Things that we can kind of very easily help out with are discussing prostheses, which are associated with improvements in body image and self-esteem, talking about sperm banking, and then really being involved in those efforts to minimize the long-term side effects. Thank you. Appreciate your time.